Today we're going to discuss the paper Measuring Reporting Conservatism, written by Givoli, Hain and Natarian and published in 2007. We start with looking at a normal day at the office of a company. We consider two situations, the company facing bad news and the company receiving good news. Let's first have a look at the situation in which the company faces bad news. The bad news is that the estimated useful life of machine X has decreased with, let's say, 5 years. This means that the company has to record an impairment on the machine's balance. This decline in value immediately reduces current earnings, which shows that the bad news is reflected in earnings very rapidly. Now let's consider the second situation in which the company receives good news. The good news reveals that the estimated useful life of machine X has increased with, let's say, 5 years again. This means that the amount of depreciation is lower for each of the upcoming years. This decrease in the annual depreciation expense will lead to higher future earnings, whereas it will not change the current earnings of the company. By using this simple example, we have demonstrated that earnings reflect bad news more quickly than reflect good news, which is captured in Besu's model as conservatism. He makes a difference between good and bad news based on the signs of the annual stock returns. Decreasing stock returns follow after bad news, whereas increasing stock returns follow after good news. Besu uses the differential timeliness measure to capture conservatism. This measure takes the difference in timeliness in which good and bad news is reflected in the stock returns. Throughout the years, this measure has been used extensively in several studies. Our paper critically evaluates the DT measure and raises questions about its interpretation as a benchmark of conservatism. Accordingly, the study identifies three aspects that have a negative influence on Besu's DT measure. The first instrument that affects the DT measure is the aggregation effect. The aggregation effect states that the two extremes value offset each other. Let's use machine X from our introductory example again. Imagine that suddenly the machine breaks down, which means the machine has to be removed from the balance sheet, leading to a decrease in the earnings and stock returns of the company. An identical machine, machine Y, has been upgraded during the next year, raising its useful life. Machine Y is now able to generate more value than initially expected, and this leads to increasing earnings and stock returns for the company. The effect of each event on earnings individually reflects the true DT measure of conservatism, whereas the aggregate of these two events partially offset each other. Therefore, the DT measure overshadows the presence of conservatism, even when it is present in the data. The second feature is the effect of the nature of economic events. This feature indicates that the stock returns of the current period will be affected after an event, but the earnings of the current period will not be affected. As an example, let's take a pre-announced increase in the tax rate from 30 to 35% as of next year. The change in this number will influence stock returns, because the change in tax is instantly taken into consideration. The earnings will not change, because the increase does not yet apply for the current year. Next year, the earnings will decrease because of the higher tax payment. The last aspect is the disclosure policy effect. The timing of information disclosure affects the earnings-return relation and thus the extent of conservatism as captured by the DT measure. In other words, the more quickly that firms tend to disclose good news, the longer the lag before it is incorporated in earnings relative to bad news. Companies therefore have to determine the best time to announce their earnings to get the best possible effect on the stock returns. Again, this shows that returns directly respond to the release of news and that earnings respond much later. Our paper provides evidence that the DT measure suffers from serious measurement errors in many settings. Interestingly, Besu's DT measure fails to show conservatism in situations where it is likely to exist, whereas it detects conservatism in cases where this is not likely to be present. Therefore, it is beyond all expectations that the DT measure exclusively captures conservatism, which is its initial task. The main message from this paper is that when using the DT measure, these three aspects should be recognized and controlled for in order to avoid wrong interpretations.
created using Powtoon.